can come alive. Sturdy, steady, we are ready. Feel the fire. We are, we are, we are, we are, we are stronger together. We are, we are, we are, we are, we are stronger together. No mountain high rises alone. It's you and
Welcome to Tuesday Night Live. My name is Zach. I'm the online pastor here at Village Church, and I hope you're able to join us last week where we heard about calling and purpose. If you weren't, that's okay. Dr. Rick Gosen is going to summarize what does purpose and calling mean. And tonight we're going to look specifically, how do you find that purpose and calling, and how does that really translate into the workplace? So I'm excited. I know this is going to be helpful, so let's get into it.
Welcome back. Today what we'll be doing is looking at discovering your calling in life and work, but we'll focus on the process of calling. So in the first session, we focused on the parameters, laying a bit of a foundation. So we talked about the idea of meaning generally, meaning at work, and then a Christian approach to meaning at work, which is rooted in the notion of calling. So that was all about the parameters of discovering meaning in life and work. Today, what we'll focus on is the actual process. So in a sense, it's a little more practical or down to earth. Now, before we get started with this conversation, I've got a quote from this fellow up there, and I'm not sure if anybody knows who he is. I'll get to that in a few minutes, but a very influential preacher in the 1800s in Victorian England. He was known as the Prince of Preachers. And he had a church, had over 10,000 people jammed into that church every Sunday. Extraordinarily influential person. I don't know if we'd want to say he was the Rick Warren of his day or Andy Stanley or something like that, but hugely influential. And he had a great way of driving home points very vividly. And he was a big believer in the concept of calling. And the interesting thing is, there's collected notes of his sermons ranging, I think there are 30, 40 volumes. So a lot of what he preached on has been recorded. So in any event, here's what he said about calling. Let each man, of course, each person, each individual, let each man find out what God wants him to do, and then let him do it, or die in the attempt. Now, when you hear that, to our Western mindset, it sounds melodramatic. It sounds way over the top. This is like way too extreme. Who would give their life for anything in our culture? Like really, who would actually believe in something so fervently that they would actually risk their life? Now, some people do, but it's not that common. So what Spurgeon, and this is Charles Spurgeon, what Spurgeon would say is, calling is so important. So number one, find out what you're supposed to be doing, do it, or give up everything trying to do it. Well, the reason I have this quote is it reminds me a little bit of our friend William Milne, who I referred to in our previous session. So this missionary who went from Scotland all the way to Malacca, died at age 37, buried halfway around the world. His wife died there, his kids died there, and in 37 short years, he had a massive impact, but basically, he died in the attempt of fulfilling his calling. So today what we'll do is discovering your calling in life and work. And as I mentioned, this is the process of calling we'll be talking about. So here's what we'll cover in our session today. First, I'll give a bit of an overview as to the topic. And then secondly, we'll focus on what I call vocational discernment. And we'll do that by using what we refer to as a vocational pyramid. So if you imagine a pyramid with a number of levels, we'll start off looking at different aspects as to how you would pursue the notion of finding your calling. Then lastly, we'll look at the process of calling, and I've got examples of 5 different individuals that we'll focus on. So some of you may be wondering, what are some examples? How do people actually exercise their calling, discover their calling? Well, we'll look at 5 practical examples of people who have exercised their calling and how they did that. And I refer to it as the 5 Ps. So it's not quite like a good sermon with 3 Ps or 3 points, but we have the 5 Ps. So basically 3 Ps plus 2 bonus Ps. So it's even, dare I say, not quite better than a sermon, but different than a sermon. All right, so overview. Let's look at the process of calling first. So I've got Charles Spurgeon up here, and it's interesting because I like quoting him or referring to him because he's got so many great insights, and in fact I've heard him quoted in many sermons, various places over the years. So if you want to read some good biblical analysis, Spurgeon is definitely a great source. So how did he view calling? Because of course, he had his own calling to the ministry, and there was various people who would approach him, and he was, of course, mentoring other people who wanted to go into the ministry. So how would they actually discern their calling? So here's some real practical tips. So before we get into the vocational pyramid, I'll just talk about some real basic things in terms of how you can think about calling, and some of these may apply to you. So first of all, there should be an all-consuming desire for the work. Now, it's interesting, all-consuming desire for the work. So if you're not excited and passionate about it, then you're probably not called to it. Now, we can probably think of lots of examples of people who, if you bump into somebody at an airport or somewhere else and you ask them what they do, and maybe they're maybe they're a special needs teacher, maybe they're working with animals, maybe they're in business somewhere, but all of a sudden you ask this person a few questions, and then you could just see them zone in, and they are talking excitedly about that particular area. Or you talk to an accountant, and you talk to some of these people who get so excited about dealing with, Revenue Canada and all the ways to interact with them and save people money. And you go, wow, that's interesting. And you may be thinking to yourself, that's definitely not me. I would definitely not be interested in that. And thank goodness there are people who are interested in that. Takes all kinds. But this is a critical aspect of calling. Is there an all-consuming desire for the work? So if someone was going into, say, preaching, well, you would think that person would be wanting to learn about preaching, come up with, more biblical insights, studying other preachers, reading more books about it, just really consumed with doing a great job at that. Secondly, recognition of capacity. So this is something that involves a little bit of soul searching. It's quite fascinating because, all of us might know individuals who we might think they're good at something, but they themselves know deep down, just like we all do, whether we really have what it takes to succeed in a certain area of endeavor. And that might be because, we want to be in a certain field and maybe we had some negative experiences, some negative feedback. And then when people gave us those comments, we maybe realized that, maybe I'm not cut out for that. Now, this is different than being a so-called quitter. It's not like you have the ability and you just quit, but rather something where you felt, I'm really outside my strength zone. This is really not something that I'm suited for. So for Spurgeon, a very interesting recognition of capacity. Is this really something that I can see myself doing, that I really think, I have the ability to do? Thirdly, evidence of fruitfulness. So again, this is a really interesting point. Is there some evidence that you're actually good at what you do or impactful? So let's say in a Christian context, if you wanted to be an evangelist, but no one had ever come to faith through your efforts, or you want to be an apologist, but no one was ever swayed by your position, or if you want to be a teacher, but there's no evidence that you're actually a good teacher. Now, these things seem so obvious, but you often meet people who have an idea that they want to do something, but they've never actually had any evidence that they're good at it or that they're effective at it. So, third point, evidence of fruitfulness. So, for example, if somebody came to Spurgeon and said, I want to run a big church like you do. Well, have you run a little church? Or I'd like to preach in front of 10,000 people. Well, have you been effective preaching in front of 10 people or 100 people? So again, this sounds a little bit like common sense. Fourth, affirmation of others. Now, this ties in with something I mentioned before. Remember we talked about this idea of calling from a Christian standpoint, not just being something that is determined by the individual alone, but is actually a community gift. So as I mentioned in the previous talk, we referred to gifts are for the community, according to the grace that's been given to us. So we all have different gifts, but we're working in community. So on one level, we have to have the self-recognition of capacity, but then in addition, we also have to think about, is there affirmation from others? So if you think of in your own life, when you look at calling, if you thought you want to get into music ministry, well, are there people in your church or who've heard you sing and lead worship who say, wow, I believe you really have a great gift? And sometimes what I've experienced is that often random people can give you affirmation. You know, it might be somebody at a church who says something positive to you. You don't even know them that well, but they've just affirmed something. So those types of things can be very, very impactful. So in terms of Spurgeon, when he talked about calling, these are the types of things that he counseled people to bear in mind. Now, another way to look at the process of calling. So again, we're trying to look at really practically. So we talked about previous session, parameters of calling, a bit of the big picture concepts. But now this is getting down to the really nitty gritty. Let's look at practically how you can understand calling. So pursuit of personal calling. So first one, pretty simple, read the Bible. Now you might think, well, that sounds so obvious. Why does it even need to be said? But you know what? When I've talked to people and they ask, well, I'm trying to discern my calling. Like, I don't know what to do. What's my passion? What's my calling? Well, it sounds a bit too in your face, but if you ask the people and say, okay, so we have a guide, the Bible, God's revealed word. Have you read the Bible? Especially focus on all these aspects of calling. Are you trying to discern how God could be speaking to you? Most typically, the answer is no. It's more focused on me, and I want God to just come and, give me the answer. Write it down, give me the answer. Now it's all clear. So, number one, read your Bible. Secondly, develop a heart for God. Now, what Waltke means by that is develop through spiritual disciplines the spiritual sensitivity to how God might be speaking to you. For everyone, this may be different. For some people, it may be, first thing in the morning when they have their morning coffee, they like the solitude, the quiet, and where they can read the Bible, pray, meditate, and really try to listen to how God may be speaking to them. For other people, it may be something different. It may be through conversation with trusted believers where they can process things. But critical thing is, are you actually developing that spiritual sensitivity to hear God speaking? Because we know people can shut God out. And yet, at the same time, they expect God to just jump over the fence, tell them, here's exactly what I want you to do, here's your calling. Now, thirdly, seek wise counsel. So this is a really interesting point that Waltke makes. Seek wise counsel. So one thing I found is that most people don't seek wise counsel. A lot of people don't know where to find wise counsel. People may get counsel, but it may not necessarily be wise. Related to that, often people focus on peers, which is not always the best thing. Now, the reason I mention that is because we'd like to think everybody has our best interests at heart. We'd like to think that. Hopefully that's true most of the time, but it's not always the case. So if you're talking to your peers and you're thinking of going to university and you're saying, what, it's amazing, I finished top of my class and I've been accepted into Harvard and Oxford and I'm just torn, I just don't know what to do to accept the $100,000 scholarship here at Oxford or the $100,000 at Harvard. Like, woe is me, what am I going to do? Now, if you're like most people, you share that with peers, you're not going to get a lot of sympathy. So maybe you're getting advice that maybe you shouldn't go to either, just keep working at the 7-Eleven. Well, it's quite interesting. When you share that, sometimes the peers are thinking, well, okay, I'm a little jealous because I'd love to be in that situation. So what's very fascinating, what I found is that if you have people who give you wise counsel who are maybe one generation older or even further along enough, who have no competitive nature to whatever advice they're giving to you and genuinely want your best interest, they'll give you very different advice. So they'll start to press and say, well, what do you really want to do? What are the pros and cons? They'll reason with you and actually give you wise counsel and lead you to figuring out what might be the best course of action. But if you're talking to peers, sometimes you're not getting the best input or advice. And it's interesting, Jordan Peterson talks about that in his book too. In one of his, it's not the thrust of the book, but he brings it up in his book, 12 Rules, that a lot of times the peers are actually not the best people to talk to, especially depending what your background is. If you've come from an environment where people don't, and you hear this all the time, and it's written in many books, where people in your social circle haven't really gone beyond that particular town, and all of a sudden you're the bit of the star who can get out of town and get some great opportunity, not everybody's supportive. So wise counsel is absolutely critical. Now, the fourth one, does this make sense? I love this. Waltke is a very practical writer. He says, does this make sense? So in other words, God gave you a brain. God expects you to use it. It's about as profound as that. God gave you a brain. God expects you to use it. So now just a simple example. When I was in college and career way back, I was looking at getting some speakers for our college and career group. There was a leader in our denomination, and unbeknownst to me, he was, I think, on his third marriage. So he had had a couple of divorces. I think one was more messy than the other. But the challenge was, I didn't know the backstory. And so when I proposed this particular speaker, the pastor of my church knew well who this person was and said, we don't really want him speaking to our college and career group. So then when I discussed it with this particular speaker, he was quite offended, and I remember him saying to me, well, the fact that I've had these marriage problems and challenges, I'm actually planning to go into marriage counseling. I want to be a marriage counselor because I've seen how it doesn't work, and I think I can offer good advice. Now, I remember thinking to myself, even when I was in my early 20s, I thought, somehow this does not make a lot of sense. I've failed a couple of times, and it's been messy, and it's high-profile failures, but I think this now gives me insights into how to do it well. As opposed to maybe finding someone who's been married successfully for many years, and maybe as a couple have had a great ministry or something together, maybe they would be a better reference point. So I think sometimes we just need to use some common sense and say, what actually is biblical? What's actually commonsensical in these circumstances? Now, fifthly, divine intervention. So another aspect of calling is divine intervention. So that can happen. It depends on somebody's particular life story. But we've all heard of cases where people have had some circumstances, maybe in their troubled youth, they were almost at the edge of suicide and all sorts of challenges, and then they were brought back from the brink. And they feel that it was a divine intervention, that their life has been saved, that there's been a reason why they were that close to the precipice, didn't go over, and now they've got to do something significant from a Christian standpoint. So, by way of overview, Waltke gives us, some basic points as to pursuit of calling. All right, so that's a bit of the foundation. So we have a good example of Waltke giving us some insights, and also Spurgeon. So that's a bit of the overview. Okay, what I'll cover now, and what we'll spend a little bit of time on, is this notion of the vocational pyramid. So as I mentioned, some of you may have seen a concept like this before, but I want to go through it because this will help you figure out what your calling may be. So we call it vocational pyramid because it's focused on work, like what your vocation could be, but from a Christian standpoint, all that is couched within the context of Christian calling. So there's 7 levels to the vocational pyramid, and I'll just start going through them. All right, so the first one is motivation and passion. Now, this is an interesting area because previously, when I've taught a course like this or given presentations on the notion of calling, I've maybe assumed that people will be clear on their passion. So often I talk about, find your passion, pursue your passion. The passion is the foundation of your calling. But what I found is that people have talked to me afterwards and said things like, well, I don't know what my passion is. I don't feel I have any passion. I'm not passionate. I mean, I may be interested. I have certain hobbies or certain things I do, which I'm very excited about, but nothing I'd really describe as a passion. So what I want to do now is just focus a little more on the notion of passion. Now, it's interesting. There's a book written by a lady, Angela Duckworth, and it's called Grit. And it's quite an interesting book. Came out a few years ago, and it's fairly popular in the management circuit, so to speak. She's done a lot of speaking, but she talks about grit as being one of the key reasons for people being successful in life. And grit is basically the determination, the self-generated determination to persist in the face of various obstacles. So she'll talk about which kids are most successful in life and in their careers. It's not by making everything easy for them, but by instilling the grit. Anyways, as she goes through her discussion in the book, she also talks about passion. Now, it's quite interesting what she says about it. Passion begins, so the starting point is passion begins with intrinsically enjoying what you do. So she focuses on passion as something that evolves, that's developed over time. But she says it starts with enjoying something you do. So in other words, don't think of passion always as something that is instantaneous and obvious. For some people, it may be that way. Some people may have been born almost with some passion for something, whether it's being an entrepreneur or a passion for music or dance or some, acting, whatever it is. There are people like that. Like I had a friend at law school. It was surprising to me and maybe other people at law school, but I remember one of the first times I met him, he said, "I love the law. I love the law." So this guy, he's still practicing law today, and it was interesting. This guy, for whatever reason, actually loved the law, loved being at law school, loves being a lawyer. This is what he was just passionate about. For a lot of us at law school, it was, people are interested, but not necessarily that same level of passion. So passion starts with, enjoying what you do. But how do you really develop that passion that can be a foundation for calling? So Angela Duckworth says in her book, passion is sometimes equated with intense emotion. Instead, high achievers talked about passion in terms of consistency over time. So this is quite a critical distinction. Because when we talk about passion, sometimes people think passion is just being highly emotional about something. But when we talk about a trend versus a fad. So if we're dealing with somebody and they're all hyped up about something, well, we might think, oh, that's interesting. And all of a sudden, next week, they're hyped up about something else. And then the week after, about something else. So emotion is not necessarily passion, which is a big difference. Now, of course, people who are passionate about something often do get emotional about it too, but emotion alone is not passion. Emotion can be very fleeting. So Angela Duckworth says, high achievers talked about passion in terms of consistency over time. So what she points out is, as people have an interest in something, they develop that interest, and then they might get the affirmation of that interest. And then, so for example, if somebody was into acting, they might, act in some school plays, maybe at the university level. Then they get maybe they get a break and they're on, some larger stage, and they find, hey, this is actually a lot of fun. I like the people I'm with. I'm really energized. I'm getting better parts and better opportunities, and I'm on a bigger platform. You're like, wow. And then this person gets increasingly passionate about it. But that level of passion might have been different than where they started. So she says, for high achievers, they talk about passion in terms of consistency over time. And also, interest is one source of passion. Purpose, the intention to contribute to the well-being of others, is another. The mature passions of gritty people depend upon both. So what I find interesting is, as I read various management books and get insights from various people, they almost always affirm a biblical perspective. So it's quite fascinating. What Angela Duckworth concludes is that the people who are passionate, it includes purpose, contributing to the well-being of others. Well, what do we do from a Christian standpoint? Serve others and be part of God's story. We're serving others. So most people who are passionate, let's say, they're passionate to go to Africa and serve there. Like they're passionate about the serving part. It's not just the passion because, and this is quite a key distinguisher. With passion, it's not just I'm passionate because I like it and it makes me feel good, and therefore it helps me develop my particular skill set. No, what she's saying is, Angela Duckworth, that passion comes from actually the bigger purpose, serving others. That's what's really key. So when we look at the vocational pyramid, 7 levels, base level passion. So for all of you listening, think carefully about what is your passion? How could you develop it? What are your strong interests? And I will say to people that calling is discovered in motion. Calling is not discovered standing still. So if you're thinking, I don't know what my passion is, then I would say, determine what your strong interests are, and then start getting involved in something where you can exercise those interests. So if it was somebody who was interested in acting, well, if you think it might be something you can develop a passion in, okay, start volunteering, start being part of plays, start looking for opportunities. Don't sit at home waiting, because often what people do is they're stationary and they're pondering in their mind, what might I be passionate about? No, you have to discover that in motion. All right, so the next aspect of the vocational pyramid is gifts and talents. Now, it's interesting from a Christian standpoint because we would talk in terms of like spiritual gifting. So on one level, all our gifts are spiritual gifts. Now, I'll go through some biblical passages there, but in the sense of we're created in God's image. We're created as beings meant to serve, to be part of community, to contribute to building the kingdom. So in that sense, everything we do, every gift we have is a spiritual gift. So the gifts and talents we have are not natural. They are actually from the Creator. So again, we can look at, I referred to the parable of the talents earlier. So the idea of stewarding talents. So the person who stewarded their talents well, and that could be not just money, but actual abilities, was commended. Allowing your talents to go to waste, wicked and slothful servant condemned to outer darkness. It's interesting, the servant who did a great job put his money to work versus the other servant said, I was afraid. So if you think of it in terms of exercising your gifts, the right response is putting your talents to work, not being afraid. All right, so spiritual gifts. Now here's one definition. I'm sure there's many, but just to give you the basic idea. Spiritual gifts are special abilities given to believers by the Holy Spirit, equipping them to serve and minister both within and outside of the church. So special abilities. Now, what could that mean? The one example I could give is sometimes when people are involved in worship ministry, certain people, the way they sing in church, you may notice, it's almost like certain people are anointed for impact. And I think what it is that often people in a church, when they're actually singing from their soul, and somehow they're singing their character and conviction out through the song. And it's fascinating because when I listen to worship music, I have a very different feeling about it than when I listen to just music generally. Somehow worship music can be significantly impactful. Thinking of singing as a form of worship rather than just a song, it's quite interesting. A lot of songs you listen to, they can be entertaining, it can be diversion, it can be interesting, but worship songs should be impactful. But I think the people who then sing those songs, they can have that anointing for the special impact. So there's various biblical references to gifts and talents. So unity and diversity. So this idea of unity and diversity in the body. So that's 1 Corinthians 12. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. So again, we talked about that earlier. There's a self-oriented niche, or there's a gift for the community. All these gifts work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. In Romans 12, different gifts are given according to there are different gifts according to the grace given. 1 Peter 4, use your gift to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace. So you can see what I mentioned earlier about the idea that it's quite an obligation if you think your calling and the exercise of your calling incorporates your gifts, and the gifts are for the greater community. Spiritual gifts. Now I've got, again, a quote here. Each Christian has at least one spiritual gift. Now, why is that? Because we're all gifted. We all have a contribution to the body of Christ. Or we may have more than one gift, a gift mix, instead of a single spiritual gift. Discovering your gifts is a process of investigation, experimentation, and prayer. So again, it's not as if you'll just know instantly, but through being involved in various kingdom-building activities, you can and will discover your various gifts. So a spiritual gift, it would give ability and interest beyond what is expected of every Christian. Then lastly, these gifts may overlap with natural abilities, but they are expressly used to carry out God's purposes. All right, and so some of the spiritual gifts listed in the Bible: administration, discernment, faith, giving. Now, just one simple gift that I think of, the gift of hospitality. I maybe wouldn't have thought of this years ago, but I highlight this specifically because when I was growing up in our home, my parents always had visiting pastors, visiting missionaries, relatives, on and on. People would come for dinner to our place or stay overnight at our place. And I remember as a kid growing up, I didn't really think that much of it because it somehow just seemed to be the norm in our house that there was this steady stream of people coming through off and on during our growing up years. But as I've gotten older, I now think of this gift of hospitality, which is referred to in the Bible as actually very much a spiritual gift. Because what I've seen in our present age is that it doesn't seem it's as common to invite people into your home and somehow into your life and to actually share the gift of hospitality. It seems far less common today than it was in a generation or two ago to actually have somebody in your home, even to extend the gift of hospitality. Because hospitality would mean they're maybe staying at your place overnight or for a few nights. Well, that can take effort. You've got to clean up after the guest. You've got to feed the guest. And there's all these jokes in our culture about, people, overstay their welcome. This idea that the guests can get a little monotonous and annoying after a while. So to actually make the effort to look after people and to extend the gift of hospitality is not that common. And I think that gift of hospitality can have that spiritual element to it because often you're helping people out. You're hopefully encouraging them, empowering them, maybe giving them a bit of a break if they're people, visiting pastor or missionary coming through town. I've heard of people who've got summer homes say, we allow, I've got a friend who does that. He allows missionary families to go up to his place in the Okanagan and spend whatever amount of time they want there. So this gift of hospitality, I think, really can be a spiritual type gift. So what gifts might you have? So that's something where you have to practice the gifts, get the affirmation, be involved in order to discern that. Okay, so we've looked at motivation, passion, gifts, talents. Then third, your personality. So your personality will shape your vocational discernment and what you might be interested in. So there are different personality styles. Now it's interesting, God has created us in a particular manner, And there's lots of personality assessment tools out there. So there's many ways to analyze people's personalities, and people might challenge how accurate they can be, but there's some basic distinctions which can be relied on, so to speak. Interesting point. So once we become Christians, we don't have a new personality, but rather our personality has been freed up to live to its true potential. So don't think that as a Christian, all of a sudden, if you were maybe very analytical and like an engineering type profile and wanted all the details and like to analyze everything to the nth degree, well, that's not going to change when you're a Christian. So we have our basic personality styles, but your personality can be freed up to live to its true potential. Research reveals that you are born with a personal style and it's consistent through your lifetime. So maybe it would change, maybe it would modify a little bit. And when you do these psychological assessments or personality assessments, we'll talk about if someone, let's say, gets triggered by certain things, well, you try to help them modify their behavior or not go to the extremes that might be common in that profile, but your core profile will stay the same throughout your lifetime. So here's a basic way of looking at personality profiles. So it's called, often people refer to it as the DISC system. So dominance, influence, steadiness, conscientiousness. Now, just to go over some of the basic distinctions. So dominance, direct, results-oriented, firm, strong-willed, forceful. So that might be someone, let's say, a stereotype of a lawyer. So direct, results-oriented, firm, strong-willed, forceful. Very to the point, and that behavior is not modified that much. Now, the I, influence, outgoing, enthusiastic, optimistic, high-spirited, lively. So often people will say, well, that's more like the sales profile, right? Someone who we talk about, enthusiastic, optimistic, outgoing, lively, someone who's probably engaging with people might have a bit of the sales aspect to them. Now, we're not saying that the personalities are actually, the four are exclusive, because typically when you do one of these personality style analyses, there'll be a dominant and then a secondary trait. So somebody might say, oh, he's a high D, small I, that type of thing. Then there's steadiness, even-tempered, accommodating, patient, humble, tactful. This might be more of like the counselor profile. And then the fourth one, conscientiousness, analytical, reserved, precise, private, systematic. This might be more of an accounting profile. So those are very general categories, but this is well accepted stuff. So if you had any psychological assessment done or personality profiling, often they are divided into these four basic categories, and sometimes they're broken down into even more. But the point of highlighting that is having an understanding of your personality will be one factor in terms of determining what your vocational direction should be. So are you suited for whatever vocation you're pursuing? Like, is everything lining up, and is your personality a strength or an advantage to that type of vocational pursuit? Right, so the next one, so we went through motivation, passion, gifts, talents, personality, now values. So how would values fit into this? So this is a good chance to think about, well, what do we value? So have you ever thought, let me write down my top 5 values. So what's actually important to me? Not maybe what I'm projecting, but what is actually important to me? So would money be important? Is that an important value? Or success? Like, is a value being a faithful steward, being generous, being hospitable? Or is it things like money, status, success, lifestyle, what things are important? So this is a function of your environment and many other factors. So when I've taught this course previously, I'll often talk about the immigrant experience. So it's quite fascinating. People who grow up in homes where the parents were immigrants often absorb certain values that they don't actually realize are values that they've absorbed from that experience, or that the values might be different for other people. So often what happens in a home where the parents are immigrants is that the values include hard work. So the parents may not have had opportunities. Therefore, the kids need to take advantage of every opportunity. And one way to do that, surefire, is hard work. So no excuse for not working hard. Secondly, seizing opportunities. So the fact that we, the parents, had no opportunities, we want our kids to have opportunities. So there's no excuse not for working hard, seizing every opportunity you can possibly get. Thirdly, often education. Because again, the parents may have come from an environment where they had no opportunity for education, and so they drum into the kids the importance of education. So another, core sort of immigrant value. So what's interesting also is, especially when the immigrant parents are Christian, that sometimes the focus, the message will be on the prestige of the occupation. So the joke is, for a lot of immigrant parents, they want their kids to be, doctor, lawyer, engineer, accountant, some prestigious profession, some high-profile profession. So the parents can say, oh, that's my son, little Johnny the doctor, or whatever. Well, it's quite fascinating. Why would that be so important? Because they didn't have any opportunities, and there was no prestige attached to whatever job they were doing. They were probably doing a job to make money. Therefore, it's very important for the kids to have this prestigious job. So it's interesting. There's all these values wrapped up in that perspective. And that, of course, will shape what somebody wants to pursue from a career standpoint. But of course, from a Christian standpoint, we have to think this through carefully and say, well, what really are the core values I should have? So I've listed a few in the PowerPoint slide here. Core values are ones that are deeply rooted and have compelled us to pursue certain life choices and avoid others. So it can be things like excellence, creativity, excitement, friendship, financial gain, time flexibility. So that's a simple value right there. Certain jobs have a lot of time flexibility, but others don't. If you grew up in a family where they valued flexibility, maybe the parents were entrepreneurs, then the kids absorb this value of, well, I can sort of do my own thing. I get my job done, but I can do my own thing the way I want. In other families, maybe the parents both leave for work at 8 in the morning, come back at 6 in the evening. They work Monday to Friday, very regimented. And so maybe then the value is, well, diligence within certain parameters. So those are values. So number 5, providential circumstances. So what things may have happened in your life that are providential circumstances that have shaped what direction you want to go in? Now, these key events can happen whether negative or positive, and they prepare us for tasks we take on in the future. So there's cases where maybe someone has had some negative personal situation, maybe it's some abusive situation. And then as that person grows older, they decide to go into counseling. So it seems to be the case where a lot of people who go into professions like counseling and psychology have actually had challenges growing up. And somehow there's this desire to almost redeem their own experience and say, well, I went through this experience. Now it's something that I'm well positioned to help other people with. So sometimes there's circumstances like that. Or, people may have, just went off in a certain direction, had something happen, whether it's at a summer camp or some experience they've had, and it's really impacted them, and that's going to set their future direction. All right, the next one, number 6, blocks and dysfunctionalities. So this can be a bit of a barrier to reaching your vocational direction. So what might be the case there? So when we talk about, are there any idols in the person's life? So we referred to them a little bit already, but these could be things like, I might think I'm going in a certain direction. I feel my personality is a certain way, my gifting, but maybe ultimately the person is still fixated on the money that the person can make in a certain career or the prestige attached to it. So I know this is a challenge for lots of families where if one of the kids, let's say, wants to go into ministry, and the family might think, well, that's not as prestigious as going to, to be an engineer or something. And so or it's not as much status. So often for, well-meaning Christian families, that can be a big issue where the kid might want to do a certain thing, feel that's the right direction to go into, but the parents, even when they're Christian, might be resistant to it because one of the values might be that, the status, the money, the prestige is actually very important. So maybe it's not verbalized, but in fact, it is very important. So what are idols accepted societal reference points or status symbols? So I think that's something that people have to really think through carefully. What are the things that are really motivating me? And are there certain things stopping me from pursuing what I believe my calling is because they might actually be the wrong motives or the wrong values? And do we constantly undermine our effectiveness by our own actions? Now, of course, in Romans, Paul talks about that, doing what I don't want to do because I keep going back to that default mechanism of the sinful nature. All right, so now the last one. So I just want to point this out. So the last part of the vocational pyramid is the direct leading of God. Now, this may surprise some people, but as you may recall, in the first session, we talked about the idea that calling, one of the myths of calling is that somehow God will speak to me and tell me exactly what to do. Well, that's not the way calling typically works. And that's why here we have it as the last element of the vocational pyramid. So after we've looked at, motivation and passion, and gifts and talents, and personality, and values, and the providential circumstances, then tried to sift through blocks and dysfunctionalities, now we get to the direct leading of God. There's a great book, probably a number of you have heard of it. It's by Henry and Richard Blackaby, and it's all about the direct leading of God. So the book is called Experiencing God. I know a lot of churches go through the book, and there's workbooks. It's very well known. But it's interesting, when they talk about experiencing God, critical aspect, knowing and doing God's will depends upon how well you know Him and His nature. So this is similar to what Bruce Waltke and Spurgeon talked about when I referred to them earlier. This idea of how well do you know the Bible? How often are you reading the Bible, meditating on that? That's a starting point. And then in our day, so this is what Blackaby's say, in our day, God communicates to us through the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will use the Bible, prayer, circumstance, and the church, other believers, to guide us. So in terms of the direct leading of God, sometimes people think, again, the direct leading of God is this audible sign. So often people will talk about, well, I've got this job opportunity and I could go in door number 1 or door number 2, and I'm praying about which one it is. And I'm waiting for God to tell me the answer. Do I do this, yes or no? Well, I think we need to scroll back and go through a number of other steps before we can get successfully to a resolution. So again, look at peers, look at prayer, circumstances, other believers. That can help guide us. So what we've done so far is just looked a little bit generally at the process of calling, and now we looked at the vocational pyramid. And after the break, I'll come back and discuss the 5 Ps. All right, thanks for joining us again. So the last section of this presentation on the process of calling will be on what I call the 5 Ps. So now that we've talked a little bit about calling and went through the vocational pyramid, the 7 levels as to how to help think through your vocation in the context of calling, now we'll look at the 5 Ps in terms of the process of calling. So I call it 5 Ps. As I mentioned before, a lot of sermons, the letter P always seems to work. Sometimes it's the 3 Ps. Well, here we have 5. Platform, passion, purpose, priorities, and persistence. So hopefully those are easy to remember. Platform, passion, purpose, priorities, and persistence. And we'll go through each one. And for each one of these, I'll use the example of someone that I've had some contact with. Through our organization, we organize conferences, and a number of these individuals have been speakers, so individuals have had a chance to discuss this with. So the first person is this guy named Bill Pollard. He was keynote speaker at our event in 2014, and I still remember vividly, he got a standing ovation, partially because of his remarks, the quality of his remarks, but he had the bearing of the wise, sage person. He looks a little grandfatherly, and he has such a great heart for sharing with people, impacting, mentoring. It was quite fascinating. I still remember I was sitting in the front of the room, and as soon as he finished speaking, people spontaneously jumped up, gave him a standing ovation. Now, this guy has had a massive impact. So he had a company called ServiceMaster. It's since been sort of split up by a private equity firm, but in its heyday, when he was running it, they were doing $3 billion in revenue and had 250,000 employees. It was ranked as the #1 service company in the US by the Wall Street Journal. And it's interesting because what his company did is they were in the cleaning business. So, like say in office buildings, his employees are the people who come in at night, clean up the entire office building, clean up the toilets, clean up the washrooms, do all that stuff. They'd clean up hospitals, restaurants, malls, contracts with large companies. And he always talked about how it was such a key thing to empower those people because they're often in these roles where people look down on them. And he gives this great example in his book how, as part of his orientation for the company, so Bill is a well-trained person, lawyer by background, high-powered executive guy, but as part of the orientation, he had to put on the cleaning uniform and spend a week learning the business from the ground up. So he was cleaning. So he still talks about how he was cleaning in a hospital one time, and he still remembers how poorly people treated him, basically mocking him and basically treating him like dirt because of the job he was doing. So that really cemented in his mind, I have to build these people up. And so for him, it's quite interesting. He's written books like, The Soul of the Firm, and his main focus is, in terms of calling, he has a platform. So his line was always, you don't leave business to go into ministry, you are in ministry. So for him, people knew he was a believer. The company had a sort of a code of conduct. It included things like, to glorify God, and that was always commented upon because for a while, this was a publicly traded company. But he always said, I love that position because that was my platform. So when we think in terms of calling, and the first P of the 5 Ps, platform, always think of wherever God has placed you as the platform where you can make a difference right now. So it's not necessarily, I'm doing this to get to the next point, but rather he viewed his job as that's the platform for him to have an impact with a massive amount of people. When you think 250,000 people were impacted by him. So he never looked at, how can I leave this business and go into ministry? He'd always say, I was in ministry. This is, in a sense, my congregation, all these people, and I can give them dignity, and I can be transparent that the reason I take the approach I do is because of my faith. So he's a great example of using your calling as a platform. Now, in terms of passion, I like using this example. So this fellow, Mark Burnett, he's not that well known for his name, but more for his program. So he's the guy behind Survivor, Celebrity Apprentice, Shark Tank, The Voice, the Bible movie, the miniseries AD. He's married to Roma Downey, now lives in Malibu. He was our keynote speaker a number of years ago in 2013 and also received our Entrepreneurial Leaders Award. It's quite fascinating because he grew up in East London, didn't have a very good family background, poor parents. They worked. The dad worked at the Ford Motor Car plant in East London. He went into the British military, was in all sorts of dangerous situations. Anyways, eventually made his way to the U.S. Through a number of hoops and hurdles, ended up becoming this, what today is #1 producer, TV producer in Hollywood. Has had a massive, massive impact. And it was quite fascinating because when he came to Vancouver, and we talked about how him as a Christian in that Hollywood environment, like, how does that go over? Because it'd be far easier for him to say, you know what, with my faith in that environment, which is obviously extraordinarily not just non-Christian, but virulently anti-Christian, it'd be way better for him to stay popular, keep his mouth shut, his head down, just be successful doing his shows, and he'd probably get invited to a lot more social events and be more part of that crowd. But instead, he takes the exact opposite approach. He said, I want to be a noisy Christian. I'm passionate about telling biblical stories through mass media. Christians are presently the largest and most ineffective tribe in the world. One thing that almost everybody commented upon, when he came up and we were able to spend some time with him, that people said, wow, I'm really surprised how passionate this guy is about the gospel. And I remember him saying stuff like, people have to talk to me because of who I am. And they're going to hear about the gospel. So he's so successful, so many people cannot afford not to talk with him. So his approach is, I'm passionate about this. I'm trying to have an impact. I'm making movies with Christian themes. It's very clear what I'm about. He's a big backer of all sorts of Christian causes. And that's fine. They don't like it, too bad. But one thing that came through so clearly was, his passion. And I think he would say, for sure, the reason he's passionate is because this has given him true significance and meaning in life. Because he was successful already before becoming a Christian. But I think he found, like a lot of people, that all these baubles of success didn't do anything for him. And it seems that, when he married Roma Downey, who was starred in Touched by an Angel, then somehow they have this renewed focus on, as a Christian couple, making a huge difference in Hollywood. So he for sure is hugely passionate, but that comes out of his clear calling. Third, purpose. So this is a really interesting story. So there's this guy, Bobby Grunewald. Now there's something called the YouVersion Bible app, which most of you listening probably have that app. It's now been downloaded, I think, 350 million times. When we had him speak at our event a few years ago, it was probably downloaded only a couple 100 million times. So he tells the story of how he's a high-tech guy by background. He's in Oklahoma City, and he's going to a church, and he thought, you know what, I want to contribute. So even though I have a background in high-tech, and in fact, it turned out his photo was in the local paper as a bit of a high-tech guy who sold his company, made a few bucks, and so he was profiled in there. Anyway, so he's at his church, and he thought, I like music, and he made this joke about him being a white rapper. And he said, I'm not a very good white rapper. In fact, I'm a really bad white rapper, but I really enjoyed it. So I love doing music. Not that good at it, but, I enjoy it. So he's in the church band up there playing. And then one of the pastors in the audience sees him up there playing and thought to himself, isn't that the guy who was in the paper, like the high-tech guy? So he chats with him after the service and said, hey, you know what? We're thinking of using technology to get the gospel out. So we're trying to figure out how to do this. Could you meet with me afterwards? So he thought, well, yeah, okay, sure. So they met afterwards. So he mentions a number of things. One of the first things he says is, I never thought I could use my business talent for the kingdom. So he just thought, I'm a high-tech guy. I've got this expertise. I've got a great track record. But you know what? That's my business. I like music, so, okay, I'll just help out in the band. So basically the pastor said, no, look, okay, we can get other people in the band, but we need people on the high-tech side. Okay, let's try to start something. So what they do is, they thought, you know what, now this is going back a few years, so this may now sound like ancient history. But hey, there's, websites. Okay, let's put the Bible on a website. All right, so let's have the whole Bible up on the website. And he joked, now this is him telling the story, so he joked about how they put the Bible on a website, and he said, I would tell you what it was called, but you wouldn't know because nobody had ever heard of it, and we shut it down. So basically that thing went nowhere. And he said to himself, you know what, I myself, even though I did the website, I don't even like going there. He says, we need some sort of app, or not app, but we need some way to get it on like a device. And this is in the days when BlackBerry still sort of existed. So then they figured out, okay, maybe we can get it on BlackBerry. So that would, because he said, I'm traveling around, I'm waiting in lineups all the time. Hey, this would be really great if we can get it on one of these devices. Okay, so that happens. And that was sort of going okay, but not great. And then he found out that Apple, now this is really interesting. So the Apple, which is so dominant today, was not always that dominant. At one time, there was actually BlackBerry, good Canadian company, and then taken over and decimated by Apple. But he found out that, hey, Apple is allowing these things called apps to be put on the phone. And I think he said at first they were going to limit it to 200 apps. So there's a limited number of apps that would be on the phone. So when you looked for something, that's all there was. You couldn't do a search like now where there's probably like millions of them. So there's just 200. So he got in touch with Apple and was able to get the YouVersion Bible app authorized as the only Bible app at that time. So what he says is, everything we learned from the website, we took and applied towards that app. And we didn't know what was going to happen. He said in the first 3 days, the app was downloaded 100,000 times. So like in the first few days. Then he said, okay, then we knew we had something. So basically, from that time, the thing has just went ballooned, like I mentioned, downloaded 350 million times. Anyway, so phenomenal story because, like, in terms of when you talk to Bobby Grunewald, in terms of calling, he say his calling, his purpose was, how can I use technology in order to get the gospel out as much as possible? And he always jokes that, how does God fit in? Well, God is the element that takes what humanly is possible to what could only be possible with God's help. So he jokes that, if you were going to start a high-tech company doing this, what would be the first place you'd think of to start this type of company? Well, it'd be somewhere probably in Silicon Valley. And where did it start? Oklahoma. And he's been ranked, I think, in the top 100 high-tech leaders of the last X number of years. So he's gotten all these accolades, and almost certainly he's the only guy from Oklahoma who's in that category of all these Silicon Valley whiz kids. So anyway, that's a phenomenal example of purpose and using your gifting and talent for building the kingdom. So there's a great quote from him here. I would encourage people to think about calling in a way that appreciates the process and recognizes that God reveals himself in a step-by-step process without the clarity of what the destination is and being comfortable with that process. So just think about that for a second. Sometimes when we're pursuing our calling, humanly, we want to know the end point. But what he's saying is, we don't always know what the end point is, but we know we're pursuing his calling. So related to that, one really great point that Bobby Grunewald made is, he said, God, there's this great verse, God can do immeasurably more than we can ever imagine. So he jokes about how when they were coming up with the YouVersion Bible app, if they would have had this wild vision to say, maybe this thing can be downloaded like 100,000 times, that would have been absolutely mind-boggling. If they would have thought 1,000,000 times, that would have been just so off the chart, they wouldn't even dare to imagine that. And now this has been downloaded 300 million plus times. So phenomenal story of calling. Now, another aspect of calling is priorities. So this fellow here, Lord Robert Edmondson, Lord Bob, as he said we could call him. So, this guy is in the House of Lords. He's a billionaire business person based in London, UK. And I think he's since resigned from the House of Lords, but at that time he was part of the House of Lords. So he was Lord Robert Edmondson, but he said, yes, we can call him Lord Bob. And phenomenal guy, very low key, great public speaker, gave a lot of excellent insights. And it's interesting because in terms of priorities, so you think, here's this fellow who is so financially successful, and yet it was more as a result of his phenomenal gift of just knowing how to build companies, build businesses. But when he talked about priorities, he made this comment: I've always been aware of my own mortality. I've often thought on my deathbed, am I going to think about the last $1 million that I have made? Or the person in prison who is dying of AIDS in Mozambique, who I spoke to and became a Christian? So in other words, he's under no illusion as to, well, what really is important. At the end of the day, he passes away, what good is the money going to do him? But people he impacted for the kingdom, that's what's really significant. So again, when you talk to this guy, he's given away a massive amount of money. I think it's probably 200-300 million pounds. He's got a massive charity network. He's been doing a lot of great things. So he's definitely living out what he's talking about. And then lastly, perseverance. So I like this. I like this example. Alan Burnett. I'm not sure how many of you would have heard of this company or organization called the Chapels. So they own and run a couple of chapels. So there's the Stanley Park Chapel, Minaroo Chapel. I think they've got one other one. But the idea is that he said the way they stumbled into this business is that he's a lay minister. He's registered, ordained, and what would happen is you'd get Japanese tourists, for example. They want to come to Vancouver, get married here. Well, then they need a chapel to get married, and he wants somebody to officiate the marriage. So then he became this rent-a-chaplain for these sort of tourist-type weddings. Anyways, then he thought, you know what, we'll set up a business. We'll actually have a chapel business, and I think his wife's ordained also. So that was the business they're in. But that's a pretty tough business to run. I mean, it's not a big money spinner, and obviously it's going to be seasonal because it's tied into the tourist industry. So, there's been some challenges along the way, as there are with every entrepreneur. So he said, when everyone is telling me to throw in the towel, I want to be like Rocky in the 15th round. He looks like his face has been put through the meat grinder, yet he gets up and wins. Without that sense of calling, I would not be able to get up off the mat. So I love that quote because it's quite vivid. So with Rocky, his faces went through the meat grinder. He can barely pull himself up off the mat, but he must keep going. It's the perseverance associated with calling. And I think when you're focused on something bigger. So again, with Alan, I mean, he's a Christian minister. So it's a phenomenal opportunity. You've got these people coming from all over the world. A lot of them are Japanese tourists. And for some reason, people like to go on these destination weddings. And so for him, it's a phenomenal opportunity to share his faith. So, but perseverance was a critical part of that. So in terms of perseverance, a few good verses to keep in mind. 2 Timothy 4:7, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith, I've fought the good fight. So the perseverance is important. Philippians 3:12-14, I press on, forgetting those things that are behind and reaching forward, I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call in Christ Jesus. And then Proverbs 22:29, seest thou a man diligent in his calling? He will stand before kings. So the process of calling, perseverance is critical. All right, so that wraps up this session. And before I close, I just want to recap session one, just so to refresh people's memory. So session one, we covered 3 key points on calling. So first we talked about the pursuit of meaning generally, that the pursuit of meaning is so much part of our culture. What's happened is that, secondly, meaning and work have become melded together. So for a lot of people in our culture, and for Christians, their work becomes their ultimate place of meaning. And then I looked at how we can develop our Christian concept of meaning, which is rooted in calling, and how calling is such an important, vital concept for all believers. So that was session 1. So just to conclude session 2, I went over a bit of an overview as to the process of calling. So we looked at Spurgeon and Waltke. And secondly, I went through that vocational pyramid. And of course, the PowerPoints are available for you to look at. So vocational discernment, the pyramid has 7 levels. So you can work your way through each of the 7 levels. And then lastly, the process of calling, looking at the 5 Ps. So just to conclude, I'll leave you with this quote again. Let each man find out what God wants him to do, and then let him do it or die in the attempt. So I think the question for all of you to think about is, what is your calling? How important is your calling? At this point, we'll have a few more questions.
That's great, Rick. Thank you so much for sharing that. Why don't we just start and help us give some more resources. If we're really resonating with this stuff as we're watching, where can people go to find, I know you have lots of great content. Just give us some resources or some next steps to start.
So one thing I'm passionate about is the notion of calling. So the book I've referred to is on entrepreneurial leadership, but it's about finding your calling. Also, I've written a whole bunch of blog posts on calling, about 30. So if you go to the Entrepreneurial Leaders Organization website, lots of good stuff there. On top of that, there's a number of great books. The one book I'd recommend is Os Guinness, The Call. That's a bit of a classic book. I think that's probably plenty to start with. I mean, of course, if you Google, call or calling, lots of stuff will come up.
That's great. I just want to start with the Mark Burnett quote you said, and you kind of glossed over it, but this was one of the most powerful things as you're sharing, as he says that the Christians are the largest and most ineffective tribe in the world.
Yeah.
And you just kind of said that, but to me, this is really, I think, the heart of everything. The reason why any of this is important is because of that crazy fact.
Dynamic,
And that, we are out there, there's Christians everywhere. Lots of times you might not even know that some of your coworkers are Christians, go to a different church. And I just wanted to re-emphasize that. And if you have any comments.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you picked up on that because it's such a big concept, and I sometimes emphasize it more. But I'll just say, the reason this came up, and we talked to Mark about it, is so Mark Burnett did not grow up as a Christian. So he became a Christian later. So it's quite interesting getting the perspective of someone who's sort of new to the Christian community. And when he spoke and when we talked to him privately, he's almost like exasperated at, there's so many Christians, and yet it's this largest, most ineffective tribe in the world. And the main reason is the fragmentation. So it's interesting that Protestantism is self-fragmenting, because new churches keep springing, and then they beget new churches, and there's no overarching leadership. So I think for a guy like him, it's so aggravating that, so he's in Hollywood, where Christianity gets dumped on, ridiculed, mocked, and I think he feels like he's like the only guy up there taking all the shots, and yet somehow, the Christian community is not well organized enough to impact anything. So, yeah, for him, that's why I think he's extra noisy to combat that.
Well, I think that's really important. I remember when I became a new Christian, I was later in my high school year, so I was 18 years old, and I remember meeting another Christian outside of my circle for the first time. And I remember just thinking, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian. We have such this connection. And for the first couple of people, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. Oh, do you know that I'm a Christian? We have this thing. And for them, it was like, oh, cool. But I was surprised, why isn't this more exciting? This is one of the greatest things ever. And I think this docile kind of attitude can slowly creep in that we've all experienced. And so that's so important. I got a bunch of questions here, but we'll just highlight a few. When we're talking about our desires or interests, you have this idea about, interest plus purpose is kind of what you can land on. And we're looked at some pretty successful people as examples. But when you're just getting started, what is just speak into what is some good advice for maybe a middle ground? Because we can think about this high, I want to invent an app that affects the world, or it could be very generic, like I just want to help people. There seems to be this middle ground of a direction that seems like a good way to start. Do you have any advice for, like, when you think about your interest and you think about purpose, where would kind of be a generic yet narrow area to focus on when you're first kind of experimenting with this?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think this, like, if you look at that vocational pyramid, I think for a lot of people, the starting point is, what are they passionate about, and how do they stay true to that passion? And it's not, I guess the thing I would emphasize is, it's not the overall impact, it's actually living true to your calling. So it's not, like when I said before, it's not an objective standard. Like an objective standard would be, I've impacted 10 people positively. Well, you've impacted 15, so you're sort of 5 better. But this person has impacted 1,000, so they're even, well, no, it's this idea of we all have our own unique calling. So that's why I say it's subjective, meaning that there's no objective standard. So for all of us, it's a matter of determining, what is my calling and my job. I mean, I could be, we hear these stories all the time. I could be a school teacher at some local school, do a phenomenal job. Like I know I've heard of, teachers where after their career, they may have impacted 5,000 kids. And you know how often there's people who will say, I remember Mrs. Smith in grade 3. And so you think that person, unlike the people I've referred to who are well known, there's lots of people who are living calling in the trenches, who are doing what they've been called to do. Maybe nobody ever knows of them, but they're having a massive impact. And that's all we're responsible for. Because when I listened to the sermon like that Mark did on greed, I thought calling is actually an antidote to greed, because greed means I want money. Why do you want money? Well, because you're associating your identity with money. Like the money is important because it buys you status, it buys you things. But that means your identity is coming from that. It's not coming from your calling. Like in the Bible talks about godliness with contentment is great gain. Well, if you're content, then you don't need money. It doesn't mean anything, right? So again, I think the calling it's subjective, because the problem with most people is they always look at someone else and go I wish I had that. I wish I was like that. But you're not responsible for that. You're responsible for yourself. The one great line, there's this guy, Oscar Wilde, who was, this playwright from days gone by. And he said, don't try to live someone else's life. It's already taken. And I thought, it's so funny. It's so true. Why would you try to pretend to be somebody else? They're already there. You're only responsible for being yourself. So then you can be content with that.
That's great. It ties into this next point that you talked about, this idea of passion. And when you first started doing this, it wasn't a concept. You just find your passion and go on. But now you're starting to see people are like, well, I don't know my passion. And I wonder if one big cause is fear of missing out. This idea of social media is now, you get to see there's so much opportunity in this world. How can you just pick one thing to be passionate about? And I wonder if you've had any experience with that, or if you had any encouragement or advice to say, when you're thinking about what are you passionate about, what are you interested in, especially you scroll in social media and you just see a million things you could be doing. How do I just pick one? I don't know if you've experienced any of that or you have any advice for that.
Well, what really struck me is when I did this presentation at another church, and a couple of people came up to me, and they were maybe early 20s. And actually, a lot of people came to the session were early 20s and in their 20s. And at first I was sort of floored when this guy said, I don't know what my passion is. I.e., I am passionless. And I remember thinking, wow, I mean, nothing? No. And this is a good Christian guy, devout. And I thought, I was almost taken aback. And then I thought, it felt like he was immobilized a bit in terms of And again, other people when I've taught this class, they'll say, you know, I've got my job, like whatever I'm doing, I'm making my money, but it doesn't do anything for me. So, I mean, I think all we can do is, like I'd say, it takes a lot of work and effort, like discerning and testing things. And I think in our culture, it seems like there's so much noise and distraction almost.
Yeah, and I think you said finding your calling is found in motion.
Yeah.
Stand still. I think that's so important to just start. Somewhere, right? It's kind of the first step is starting.
Yeah. Well, that's what this guy, like, because when I've talked to people, it often comes across like I don't know what my passion is, so it's like I don't know what to do. So I'm sort of doing nothing. But if you want to discover your passion, I have an interest in this. Well, okay, you can volunteer places, you can contribute here and there, you can test things out, and then that passion will grow. But it seems that people are like immobile, like I don't know, and like it's passive. I'm waiting for the coconut to land on my head.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Moving on to personality, you showed the DISC diagram with the four quadrants.
Right.
Are personality tests essential when you're doing this process? I assume they're helpful. You know, we have Myers-Briggs, Berkman, you know, the maybe controversial Enneagram, something like that. How essential are these personality tests when kind of going through this process?
Well, I've done a number of personality tests. I'm familiar with Berkman and a number of other systems. I think they're helpful but not conclusive. Like I always find it's more like it's sort of interesting, right? Like it almost affirms that, okay, yeah, I realize I'm that way. I think one thing it does is it can show you more about yourself, because you might think you're completely unique, but in fact, people with that profile will often act a certain way.
Right.
You know.
That must be. We're not all unique snowflakes in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Maybe just leave us with this. I'm thinking about someone, they're going through this process, you know, walking through, okay, the pyramid steps, kind of end result, finding my passion. How long is this process? You know, paint a picture about, can I do this next weekend if I take some time away? What is this process going to look like for me going forward?
You know, the wrong answer is it's a lifelong process. The other answer is it's 5 easy steps. Right. And then, of course, there's somewhere in between. But I think I think people can discern it, like make progress relatively quickly. Like it's almost like organizing your thoughts. I'd say applying some effort. You know how a lot of people go through life actually not thinking about a lot of stuff. Like it's quite interesting when you talk to a lot of people about meaning. It's like it's as if they're living. They've never thought about it before. So I think for Christians, you know, we examine calling. I think you can start to work through the steps and make good progress. But I think I think it's part of the ongoing spiritual discipline.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, is that a good idea for someone to take some time away over these next couple of weeks of this process? You know, doing that self-reflectiveness, thinking about it does take some time, but then also action on top of that.
Yeah. See, I think what would be interesting is so people to reflect on it. But let's say if a person could find, let's say, a couple of people who could provide wise counsel, because one thing that's no longer surprised me, but always did, when you might talk to someone and give them a word of affirmation, and it's like they've never gotten that before. I'll give you one quick example. I was on a plane one time, and I don't always talk to people beside me. And I was reading a book, and sometimes I read these books, they look like textbooks. So this girl sits beside me, she's, I think, early 20s, and she says, oh, you know, are you a professor? So I start talking to her, and then she says, I asked her a few questions. She says, well, I'm finishing my undergrad, and she says, I want to go to law school. I said, oh, I went to McGill. She said, oh, I want to go to McGill, but I don't think I could get in. And so I basically said to her, I started asking her a bunch of questions like, well, what are your marks? What are your extracurricular? Are you bilingual? Blah, blah. I asked her all these questions. And I said, absolutely 100% you'll get in. And I know the dean. If you don't get a response, let me know. I'll talk to the dean. Guaranteed you will get in. Anyways, her name's Rachel. She went, applied, she got in, she graduated a number of years ago. And I remember thinking, like, the chances of me sitting beside her and that happening is quite unique. But my point in all this is that, like, if you talk, you can get affirmation from people, like ask people things, like get the peer, maybe peer counsel, wise counsel, ask people maybe what they think you should do, and then sort of discern that process. So I think here's this young lady. I thought, it's so odd that talking to her within minutes, I could see absolutely go for it. Right. And I thought, well, what if I wouldn't have met her? Like, like you wonder, but see, for in the Christian community, if you think of who in the community, like if you're in your 20s, like who could you talk to who might know you or know your family, whatever, who could speak some wisdom in?
Right, looking for those older people, usually that have a little bit more experience.
Yeah, and I think sometimes older people, if they've been through that same path, they can see the pattern exactly. Mm-hmm. Like I remember when I was at Trinity Western, because I taught business law, so I taught about 1,000 students over a 10-year period. I taught business law in the School of Business. And every once in a while, students would come to me and say, do you think I should go to law school? And I remember as a professor, I'd sit in my office, Professor Ghosten routine, they come in, and I would say, absolutely 100%, you should go, you'll get in, you'll do well. And other people I'd say, I don't think so. And it's interesting because, okay, I could say that with a lot of certainty because I'm much better than their parents, or anybody who knows them, because I've had 1,000 students. I can judge you against 1,000 students. And they're, so again, if they would just ask, and so with everybody, say, who's listening, if you're thinking of in terms of calling, you ask people who are close to you, you'd be surprised, like what they would see.
That's amazing. That's great. I think that leaves everyone with a lot of process and challenge. But
if we go any further, it'd be too much of a good thing.
Yeah, there we go. So yeah, just encourage you to check out those resources. I was looking at your website. There's tons of stuff there, and I think that more than enough to process to get people into this process. But thank you so much for doing this. I know this has been a huge blessing to everyone out there. Let me just pray.
Yeah,
for everyone
perfect.
And for you.
Great.
So, Jesus, thank you for this time, and thank you for Rick, who helped us and is helping people just be more focused on you and understanding that when we give our life to you, Jesus, that is not just a segmented part of our life, that is our whole life. And when we really give up our whole life to you, you bless us, not in a prosperity way, but just that we get to find joy and purpose in every single aspect of our life. So Holy Spirit, would you just be with everyone who's watching right now? Again, speak to them, bring to front of mind things that they need to focus on, to work on, to change. And I just ask that you continue to help us along this journey so that we can glorify you with every single aspect of our life. And so that would bring us contentment in you ultimately. So thank you, Jesus, for who you are. And I just pray this all in your glorious name. Amen.
Amen.
Open your hands, stand in the light, watch it begin. We're gonna shine, growing change.